Hello, classmates and Dr. T. This is Nicole Dalton, and this is my Week 2 Multimedia Discussion Board for MPA 545. And a little housekeeping before I get into my presentation. I have noted all of the journals at the bottom of my presentation for you to refer back to. With that, I'll get started. The first concept that I'll be covering is transformational theory, noted in Chapter 1 on page 9. And this theory goes into the concept that conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. Conflict can actually result in positive change for an organization as a whole. And Kozer goes into this in his article, stating that this conflict is the sticking point between a person who thinks things are good the way they should be, as opposed to somebody else who sees the change that could happen if they do change. So that conflict is what they're discussing. So an example of this in an organization is a director goes to a business license technician and explains that they need to change their process, but the business license technician thinks that what they're doing right now is fine how it is and it doesn't need to change. But what the director sees long term is that changing the process can result in lower wait times for customers, less paperwork processing for staff, meaning that they can process more business licenses in a day. And without this conflict, that change would never happen. If the director let it go, then there would be no change and no improvements within that department. So that is transformational theory. The next concept is intergroup conflicts, noted in Chapter 2, page 21. And this is the concept that larger groups of people are more likely to have conflict than small, like individual people themselves. So Carl Morita and Lapworth created this concept of ethnocentrism, where this disconnect happens between these groups of people. So an example of these two different groups of people could be management and the staff that makes up the organization. And I firsthand experienced this during the COVID pandemic when management had to quickly make decisions on budget cuts, staff cuts, so that way they could get the organization out of the pandemic and make sure they were still generating revenue for the organization. And that created that concept of ethnocentrism, where the staff felt really disconnected and didn't understand why certain decisions were being made. And so that's where that conflict came, because they felt that there was a disconnect between staff and management. The next concept is the comparison of conflict styles, noted in Chapter 2, page 27. And this covered 4 different types of conflict resolution. And these 4 are forcing, compromising, avoidance, and problem solving. And it's important to note that although problem solving was the most effective way to resolve conflict, sometimes that's not always going to work, and you have to use those different conflict styles to resolve problems when it's most appropriate. And in Phillips and Cheston's article, they said that knowing when to use the problem-solving concept was more important than knowing how to use it. So for example, if there's a group that works really closely together and they're going to have to work together in the future, they're more likely to solve the problem than to have conflict that's going to stew over time and result in a hard work environment down the road. It's also important to note that you have to have people in the group who aren't necessarily worried about beating or defending their own beliefs just to win the argument. There's people in that group that want to actually solve the problem and come to a solution that's going to benefit the organization and that decision as a whole. So that's the comparison of conflict styles. The last concept is factors that promote mutual gains negotiation, noted in Chapter 3 on page 48. And one thing that's widely agreed upon is that trust is something that can resolve conflict before it even happens, or when there is trust, it's more likely to get resolved in a nice manner. And noted in Shapiro, Shepard, and Cheriston's article is that there's 3 levels to building trust. The first level is deterrence. So deterrence is if I get hired for a position, they trust that I'm going to get that job done because I was hired for it. The next level is knowledge. So let's say historically there's 2 departments that haven't worked well together and they're trying to work on that relationship. Once those 2 departments start sharing information with one another, they're going to start building trust, and that relationship with one another. And the last tier for this is identification. This is knowing that somebody trusts one another. So let's say the deputy city manager appoints a new project manager on something that they've never done before. The reason why they're doing this is because the deputy city manager trusts that project manager to get the job done, and they'll figure it out. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to listening to all of yours. Have a great weekend.